Hi, I'm Dr. Christopher Miller, and welcome to a lecture about the Svetambara and Digambara sects within the Jain tradition. This lecture will follow Paul Dundas's book, The Jains, pages 45 through 59. As we dive into this lecture, I'd like you to just observe the two pictures on the title card for the lecture. On the left, you see Acharya Mahapragnya. On the right, you see Tarun Sagar. Both of these ascetics, these monks within the Jain tradition, had a commitment to the Jain way of life, Jain philosophy, so on and so forth, and they propounded it in their own ways. Tarun Sagar even got involved in Indian politics during his lifetime. As you can see here, he's speaking to an assembly of politicians without any clothes on. And that's one of the fundamental distinctions between these two sects, as you can see. The Shvetambara, you see on the left, Acharya Mahapragnya, belonging to one of the sects within the Shvetambara sect, wear clothing, and they wear white clothing, and we'll look at why that is. The Digambara monks at the highest order, however, wear no clothing, and that's why you see Tarun Sagar here wearing no clothing as he's talking to the assembly. So we're going to unpack this as well as a number of other things and differences between these two sects in this lecture. The topics that we'll look at will be, we're going to consider what the primary differences are between the Shvetambara and the Digambara sects. We're also going to talk about what the names themselves mean. We'll look at the sectarian origins between these two sects, how did they come up, and the reasons for their differences. We'll consider some of the gender disputes between these two sects. We'll look at archaeological evidence to try to figure out how they became two distinct sects. And we'll also look at the way that these two sects interact with one another at a very basic level. To give an overview, Dundas points out that there is no original Jainism, quote unquote, that can historically and through a scholarly method be identified. We simply don't have evidence for an original Jainism. Now, that being said, if you talk to a Jain practitioner or a member of the Jain tradition, they will definitely tell you that the Jain teachings that came from Mahavira and the Ford makers are timeless and universal. So from the perspective of a Jain practitioner, it doesn't matter if we think there's an original Jainism or not, according to the scholarly scientific method to the approach of the study of religion, right? For them, the teachings are timeless, universal. They always have been, and they always will be. Time is cyclical, as we recall, and these Tirthankaras will continue to come to give the teachings through every cycle to humans to remind them of their potential to be liberated. But from a scholarly perspective, we simply don't have evidence to show that, hey, this was the true original core Jainism or Jain tradition, and it can be located in this text or in this piece of archaeological evidence or in this story. We simply can't say definitively that there is an original Jainism. But another thing that's important, and perhaps more important for us to consider as we study this academically, is the notion of a Sampradaya, which you see in bullet point number 2 here. A Sampradaya is what we're briefly or sort of translating as sect, very broadly is what I mean to say. Very broadly, we're translating Sampradaya as a sect, but it's more than that. It's really a lineage. It's a lineage of transmission of teachings that comes through a particular line of Jain teachers. So for example, to the right, you see Acharya Mahapragya's lineage. So Acharya Mahapragya was the Acharya that I showed you on the first slide, wearing his white clothing. An Acharya is a high teacher of the highest order in the Jain tradition. And here you can see that this image is showing how Acharya Mahapragya, as well as the other Acharyas that you see pictured here who have been in this same lineage, tie themselves all the way back to Bhikshu, who is in the center of the photo. Now, we will take a closer look at this lineage in a future lecture, but I just want you to understand that what's important, I guess, from the study of the Jain tradition from an academic standpoint is understanding how teachings are transmitted through these sampradayas, through these sects of Jainism, and how they come to understand themselves as transmitting the true or the most true form of the Jain tradition or the Jain teachings or Jain Dharma. Okay, so Sampradaya, when you hear me say sect, I'm referring to these Sampradayas, these lineages of transmission of the Jain teachings that are taken up by a number of different gurus and acharyas of the highest order. So we'll take a closer look at them as we move on. There's a high value, as you see in the third bullet point, within the Jain tradition, and not just the Jain tradition, but also in other Indian traditions, on the correct transmission of religious teachings from one generation of teachers to another. Okay, so if you belong to one of these Sampradayas, you will tend to assume that you are in the Sampradaya that has the correct transmission of the teachings of the Jain tradition, going all the way back to Mahavira and the Ford makers. And there are two main Sampradayas that we can identify, and they split into smaller subgroups within. So there are sects within sects, but these are the two main ones that we've been talking about since the beginning of this lecture series. And these are the Svetambara, number 1, and the Digambara, number 2. I'm going to start here by explaining the meaning of these two names, because it is the meaning of these two names that really sets a foundation for who these Sampradayas understand themselves to be. The Svetambara come from the two words Sveta and Ambara. Sveta means white, and Ambara means clad. So these are the white clad. All the ascetics are white clad, meaning they're clothed in white, right? So a Svetambara is someone who wears the white clothing of a monk or a nun. So for example, to the right again, in Bhikshu's lineage, we can see they are Svetambaras. They're wearing white clothing. And we'll look at why they're wearing this kind of clothing in a moment. But the other important thing to understand is the Digambaras, the meaning of the Digambaras. So dig in Sanskrit comes from dik, D-I-K, which means space or sky. And Ambara again means clad. So they both have this word Ambara in their name, but the first part is what distinguishes them. Because the Digambaras, the sky clad, are clothed by the sky, and therefore they are what? They are naked. So the monks of the highest order in the Digambara sect of Jainism, or Sampradaya of Jainism, do not wear clothing, right? And we'll see why that is in a moment. So here we're going to look at the primary differences between these two sects, right? So we know that the Svetambaras wear clothing. They're the white clad, and the Digambaras wear no clothing. They are the sky clad. Why is that? Well, the Digambaras believe that they are upholding the earliest teachings and true teachings of Jainism, because Mahavira, they say, wandered naked. He had to get rid of all of his possessions. He had to even get rid of his clothes, right? Because you're not allowed to possess things in the Jain tradition at the highest order. If you're trying to achieve liberation as a monk, you cannot wear clothing, right? The other thing they would say is that clothing causes violence. So if you have to put on clothing, one, you have to take plants, right, to make the cotton. So you have to do some farming and take the plants. That causes violence, right, tearing up the earth. And when you put on your clothing, you might harm something. You might harm a creature on your body, right? So it's best to wander naked. So it fulfills the two vows of nonviolence and non-possession, for example, to be naked. So the Digambaras stand by that very much. And we'll see the Digambaras take their ascetic practice, their austerities, to the most extreme of all the sects within Jainism. The Digambaras are the most extreme in terms of their commitment to asceticism. The Svetambaras, on the other hand, argue that clothing are necessary in today's day and age. And the Svetambaras are more seeing themselves as adapting to the current day and age, right? So they wear clothing for a number of reasons, one of them being that it wouldn't be good for monks and nuns to wander around naked, first of all, right? Because that might cause some kind of temptation, right? And they're not supposed to have sex. That's one reason, right? But they also argue that it's okay to wear clothing, because if you wear clothing, you don't have to light a fire. If you light a fire, that could kill microorganism, insects, maybe even snakes, as we saw with Parshva, right? You could kill animals. So you don't have to light a fire because you wear clothing. So for the Svetambaras, they're actually saying that clothing prevents certain forms of violence and other transgressions of the vows that monks and nuns have to take. Okay, now the Svetambaras follow what is known as the Stavira Kalpa, as you see in bullet point number 2. This means the way of the elders, okay? It's suited to the present, right? They're trying to adapt to present conditions, and that is why clothes and other things that the Digambaras won't do are acceptable, for example, right? The Digambaras, on the other hand, follow what is called the Jinakalpa, the way of the conquerors, a radical path of nudity and isolation, right? So they're more extreme. They see themselves as tying back to the original practices, importantly, practices of Mahavira and his disciples and other early Jains who were nude and isolated themselves more so from society, whereas the Shvetambaras will be more involved with the lay community and so on and so forth. Okay. The Shvetambaras will use a begging bowl, right? So you see down here in the bottom left picture, you see Shvetambara monk, or excuse me, nun, receiving alms from a lay devotee, and she has a begging bowl. So she receives food in that begging bowl, right? But for a Digambara, a begging bowl represents a form of a possession, right? An unnecessary possession. So a Digambara will not use a bowl. They will not own a bowl. They will instead use their hands to beg for food. They'll receive food in their hands. And they see this also as tying back to the most truest form of Jainism of non-possession. But again, the Shvetambaras are willing to make concessions that are suited to the present. And they also believe that by using a bowl, so the Shvetambaras believe that by using a bowl, you aren't attracting insects into your hands that you might have to kill or accidentally eat, right? Because flies and whatnot will land on your hands because there's food in your hands and so on and so forth, right? So for the Shvetambaras, they actually say it's preventing violence, even though I have to own something, whereas the Digambaras are saying you have a possession that you don't need, right? So we can see there's all these little sort of petty differences, but they are important because they are part of how the Shvetambaras and Digambaras define themselves as different and carrying forward the correct transmission, right, of the Jain tradition. Now, bullet point number 4 is really important, okay? So this is not a petty concern. Number 4 says, according to the Shvetambaras, right, women can be liberated. And as we'll recall from the last lecture on the Tirthankaras, the 19th Tirthankara, Bhagwan Malinath, was a woman, right, in the Shvetambara tradition. And she achieved liberation, and she brought others to achieve liberation, right? So she was one of these great spiritual teachers within the Jain tradition. So women in the Shvetambara sect, the nuns, right, who you see pictured here, taking food and also walking with their mouth covers on, the nuns can be worked towards liberation. They can be liberated. Whereas in the Digambara sect, women cannot be liberated in this lifetime. So the nuns within the Digambara sect cannot be liberated. Why is that? Well, one of the primary reasons is that within the Digambara sect, it is not allowed for women, the nuns, to walk around naked. But walking around naked is a requirement for liberation according to the Digambaras, right? You have to shed all of your belongings, including your clothes, and not wear clothes and cause violence with clothes. And because women are required to wear clothing within the Digambara sect, they cannot achieve liberation in this lifetime. All they can hope for is that because of the good deeds and austerities that they do in this lifetime, that they'll be reborn as a man and then have the chance to be a monk and then have the chance to be liberated, right? So very important distinction to consider in terms of when we think about patriarchal culture and the way that women either are or are not allowed certain privileges within religious practice. We can see that the Shvetambaras are more open to women pursuing liberation, even though they have to wear clothing, because clothing is allowed in the Shvetambara tradition. Another key difference between these, the last bullet point, between the Shvetambara and the Digambara, is that Kevalins, those who have been liberated, right, while they're alive, people who are possessed of liberation, of the liberated state, they've burned all their karma, have to eat food to survive, okay? So according to the Shvetambaras, even if you're liberated in this lifetime, you still have to continue eating food to sustain your body. And according to the Shvetambaras, this does not create new karma, right? Because you have some sort of attachment to have to eat food. This does not create new karma in the Jain tradition, in the Svetambara tradition, in their Sampradaya, because the Kevalin has such great austerity and heat in their body from their spiritual practice that any karma that might stick to their soul, karma is a substance in the Jain tradition, that might stick to their soul from needing food or wanting to eat some food to stay alive, will immediately be burned away because they've had such great austerity, that tapas, that heat within themselves, that spiritual power, that even after they're liberated, even if they have to eat food, it's not going to cause them to be unliberated or something like that. It'll burn off right away, okay? Now, for the Digambaras, this is not true, because for the Digambaras, they claim that the Kevalin, one who is liberated, no longer needs to eat, right? You often hear these tales of people living off of air, the breatharians, right? A lot of people like to talk about people who eventually learn how to survive off of air alone, right? That's not what the Digambaras are saying, but it's analogous, right? This idea that somebody can get to the point where they no longer need to eat food to survive, right? And a Kevalin, according to the Digambaras, because they've given up all of their desires and bodily needs, does not need food anymore, right? And again, the Digambaras are the most extreme in terms of their ascetic practice, and it makes sense that they're making these types of claims. And we'll see these types of claims made over and over again as we move forward. Okay, so how did these two sects split off, right? We know why, we know what the fundamental differences are, right? But how did they get to be two different sects, right? Well, according to the there's a Svetambara account and a Digambara account of how this happened, right? According to the Svetambara, there were 8 heresies, okay? 8 practices or actions that, or doctrinal disputes that went against what they consider to be orthodox or correct Jainism or Jain teachings, right? In the 600 years that followed Mahavira's liberation, okay? The first of those heresies was that Mahavira's nephew had the arrogance to create a rival order against Mahavira, right? A rival Jain order. Well, the Shvetambaras say that rival order was heretical. Like, you can't leave Mahavira's. He was the ultimate. He was the Tirthankara. You can't go and create your own thing. It's not the same thing. You have to be in Mahavira's direct transmission, which the Shvetambaras would claim they are, right? So that was a heresy, right? Numbers 2 through 7 of these heresies had to do with doctrinal and philosophical disputes. We won't go into those right now. But importantly, number 8, this heresy number 8, identified by the Shvetambaras, challenged correct practice, right? Somebody challenged correct practice and created their own order, which would become, according to the Svetambaras, the Digambaras, okay? So there was an ascetic named Shivabhuti, who you see here in bullet point number 2, right? He self-initiated himself into Jainism, according to the Shvetambaras, right? He read that Mahavira was naked, right? So he went back into the earliest text and he said, hey, Mahavira was naked. Why are all the monks and nuns wearing clothes in this sect, right? And he founded what the Shvetambaras consider to be a heretical Digambara order, meaning Shivabhuti took his clothes off and said, I'm going to be like the original Mahavira. I'm going to go back. I'm going to create my own Digambara order and take off my clothes, and those who follow me will be practicing the true Jainism, right? So this is an account from the 5th century of the Common Era, right? So like 1,000 years after Mahavira, that tries to account for how the Digambara order emerged. According to them, it was this heretical person, Shivabhuti, who self-initiated himself into Jainism, took his clothes off after he found out Mahavira was naked, and founded this heretical Digambara order. The Shvetambaras would say, we're wearing clothes because we're adapting to the day and age, right? As time goes on and things get worse and worse and morality gets worse and worse, of course people have to wear clothes because they don't want to attempt to, tempt themselves to break their vow of celibacy, right? So, but for Shivabhuti, he said, no, we have to go back to the original. We have to be naked. And so that's the Shvetambara account of how the Digambara order was founded, or one of the accounts, okay, in the 5th century. The Digambara account is different, okay? So in the 10th century, there's a Digambara account. So now we're 500 years later. According to the Digambara account, and this is somewhat historically true and may be the case, there was a famine in the north where the Jain tradition was founded by Mahavira, right, in that Gangetic area, the Gangetic Basin. And a monk named Bhadrabahu, a great ascetic, sometime around the 4th century BCE, according to this Digambara account, took a group of ascetics, naked ascetics, down to the south, and they stayed naked in South India, and they spent hundreds of years in South India cultivating and carrying on their naked ascetic practices, right? And it wasn't until later when they came back up to the north and they met with these northern Shvetambara Jains that they looked at them and said, what are you doing with clothes on? We all went south, we kept our clothes off. Why are you all wearing clothes now, right? So that's the Digambara account of what happened. There was a famine in the north, they went south, and they maintained the true Jain teachings and practices because they didn't put clothes on, right? So we can see there's these two conflicting accounts, and there are others, but these are really central ones for understanding how these traditions imagine themselves to be carrying forward what they believe to be the true Jain dharma, tradition, or practice. And here again, you see Tarun Sagar in being carried in India. He's a Digambara monk, and he was again involved in Indian politics, very famous, involved in the Digambara sect, and was very well respected by his followers, as you can see, right? To be carrying forward what they would consider to be the correct transmission of the Jain tradition. Okay, so those are the Svetambara and Digambara accounts of how this split happened. But as Dundas points out, according to other evidence, especially archaeological evidence, the split between these two sects, between who's wearing clothes and who is not wearing clothes, the Svetambaras and the Digambaras, was more gradual. It was not this immediate thing that happened where maybe, you know, there was a famine, they left, and then they immediately became these two different groups. It was a more gradual approach to the creation of these two different Sampradayas, right? Dundas points out, interestingly, that the earliest Tirthankara images found in around the early centuries CE or BCE were naked, right? And they were found in Mathura, which is in the north of India. So interestingly, there were naked images in the north, the earliest Tirthankara images, suggesting that nudity was something that was important in the north before it went south and maintained itself in the south, right? So it was there. It was there even after this famine supposedly happened, right? It was there were naked ascetics already, at least as they were portrayed in these early Tirthankara images, one of which you see here to the right, a little bit later one, from the 5th century CE, perhaps with a naked ascetic, right? The other thing that Dundas points out is that in the north, there was a group called the Yapanyas, which you see in bullet point number 3. The Yapanyas were essentially naked, a subsect in Jainism, who maintained nudity and were faithful to the Svetambara sect, who wore clothing, right? And although they maintained nudity in the north, right? So there was some continuity of nudity in the north, they would wear a small strip over their private parts while begging, right? Just to respect the wishes of the Svetambaras and the lay people, right? But otherwise, they prized nudity, right? So here you have a sect of Jainism within or respecting the Svetambaras, who are still in the north, even if Bhadrabahu went to the south, and are maintaining nudity and nude practices in the north. Okay, so it wasn't just this split. There are still people in the north maintaining nudity within the Svetambaras and interacting and respecting the Svetambaras' wishes just to wear a small strip while they're begging for food. So, okay, so I mentioned in the 5th century CE, and as you see in the image to the right, this image of Urshaba, he's shown to be wearing a lower garment for the first time in the 5th century. Okay, so in other images of Urshaba, there are images suggesting that he's suddenly being clothed for some reason, right? Clothing is being put on him in order to send some kind of message that Svetambaras would be on board with, right? So this is again about 1,000 years after Mahavira, right? You have Tirthankaras being dressed. Okay, so suddenly there's a need to cover up. Okay, and this is in the north with the Svetambaras. Okay, and then finally, in the same time, in the 5th century of the Common Era, and we're going to look at these councils later, there were councils that were held to codify the textual canon of the Jain tradition, and they were held in the north in a number of cities, including a city known as Vallabhi. However, these councils only had Svetambaras present. There weren't any naked monks, right? So the textual canon, that which is considered authoritative, the texts that are considered authoritative and the teachings considered authoritative, were determined by the Svetambaras themselves, right? So of course they're going to favor teachings that require clothing in those particular councils, right? Because there wasn't any influence from the Digambaras in these councils, right? And so the Svetambaras gradually were able to codify what they believe to be the true teachings of the Jain tradition, but they disagree ultimately, as we'll see in a future lecture, with what the Digambaras consider to be ultimately authoritative, right? There weren't any naked monks at the council, okay? So the bias for clothing in the north was easy to maintain in the sense that by the 5th century CE, everybody was pretty much on board with it, right? But there were other people in the south, indeed, there were Digambaras who were maintaining nudity, right? So this is all happening gradually over a long period of time. So why Why nudity? Should we wear clothing or not? Well, a Digambara named Aparajita, as you see in the 8th century CE, said that nudity helps avoid pride and shame, right? So if you're nude, you just are kind of, you can't be proud. There's nothing to wear to show your pride. And also, you have to get over being shameful of your nudity, right? So it actually eliminates mental karmas and mental attachments about pride, being proud of yourself, wearing nice clothes or wearing clothing at all, and also the shame of being naked. You have to go through that. And for anybody who's gone to, anywhere where you have to be naked, right? If you go up to like Esalen, the baths in Esalen or other places like that, you have to maintain nudity when you're in certain parts, right? And that can be uncomfortable, right? Because you're either ashamed of your body or you're afraid to show your private parts or something like that, right? Well, the Digambaras wanted the monks to overcome that shame, right? Something similar to that, right? It's not the same, but it's analogous in the sense that clothing will allow you to hide that shame, but without clothing, you have to just get over it, right? Burn it off and get over any self-obsession or self-concern. Number two, being nude prevents hurting insects and plants, as I mentioned before. You won't kill insects while you put the clothing on, and you don't have to take from the earth to create the clothing, right? There's a lot of violence that goes into making clothing, as we know, right? Fast fashion, so the shirt that I'm wearing probably came from somewhere or was dyed somewhere in Asia, right? Polluted a river somewhere, required the growth of plants that were not organic, right? So there's a whole lot of pollution and violence that goes into creating the very clothes that we wear, okay? So by being naked, you're not contributing to that anymore. And number three, the Digambaras believed, again, that they were imitating Mahavira more correctly since Mahavira was naked, right? The Svetambara response, again, as we said before, and I'm reiterating here, was that clothing prevents violence because you don't have to light a fire to stay warm. For the Digambaras, if they had to light a fire to stay warm, they would, in fact, be killing microorganisms and bugs and so on and so forth with the fire, right? And the Svetambara also say, like food, clothing is necessary. Humans need to wear clothing, right? Those are some of the reasons that, these are some of the core reasons that the Svetambaras and the Digambaras argue for whether or not you should be naked or wear clothing. And so you can see here, clothing and no clothing, the debates go on, right? But ultimately, they are both committed to nonviolence, and they both sects believe that by practicing either nudity or not practicing nudity, that they are carrying forward the true teachings of the Jain tradition. So we return to this question, can women be liberated, right? And this all basically boils down to clothing. According to the Digambaras, again, no, women can't be naked, so they can't achieve liberation. But according to the Svetambaras, yes, women can be liberated. First of all, we said Mali, the 19th Tirthankara, was female. She was liberated. But Maru Devi, okay, the mother of Urshaba, the first Tirthankara, was herself liberated, and she was the first woman to be liberated in Jainism. And so from the start, going all the way back to the first Tirthankara, it was possible for women to achieve liberation, right? So if you're a woman and you're wanting to achieve liberation, you will join the Svetambaras if you're not already in one of these sects, right? Obviously, because that's what you would want to do. You want to achieve liberation if you're going to become an ascetic, right? But again, there are women within the Digambara sect who are willing to accept, as you see here in the last bullet point, they are willing to accept that they need to be reborn as a man in a future life on account of their good work, good spiritual work in this lifetime, in order to be liberated. Now, interestingly, as Dundas points out, and you see in bullet point number 3, one of the earlier texts in the Jain tradition, the Kalpa Sutra, says that at Mahavira's death, there were essentially twice as many females in every category as there were males, right? And this is really interesting. So he had more female followers than he had male followers. According to the Kalpa Sutra, for the number of ascetics, there were 36,000 female ascetics, so nuns, who were attempting to achieve liberation under Mahavira's teaching. There were only 14,000 males. In terms of lay people or householders like you and I, there were 318,000 females and only 159,000 males. And in terms of Kevalins, those who have achieved liberation, there were 1,400 females who achieved liberation under Mahavira at the time of his death, up to the time of his death, and only half as many males, 700, right? So this is in the early teachings of the Jain tradition. And although these texts were written long after Mahavira died, there's a message being sent here, right, about the role and the place of women within Jain society, really interestingly, right? So there's a lot of room for females, no matter ascetic or lay, householder or nun. There's a lot of room for spiritual development and progress that you will not find in other traditions, first of all, but also not within as much within the Digambara tradition, right? Because the women have to wear clothing. And so I want to briefly draw your attention now to this image on the right, which shows, as you can see, an inner circle of nude monks, right? So these, if they're nude and they're Jain, they must be Digambara monks of the highest order. So you clearly see these nude monks gathering around a teacher, an acharya, who's sitting up on that high seat there, hearing the teachings of the Jain tradition, listening intently, and trying to make some spiritual progress. And then around, if you go into the outer circle, at the very, very back, you see a lot of color, right? All that color is what? It's the lay people, right? These are the lay people. Again, the Jain tradition has a huge lay population, way larger than the ascetic population, who are very prosperous, wealthy, intelligent people, very philanthropic people, who are very colorful and living normal lives just like you and I, right? And so you see them out there on the perimeter listening in to the teachings of the acharya, the naked male monk sitting in the center. But then when you come to the middle circle, right, all the white, what do you see? And what students often reply immediately is they say, those are the Svetambaras, obviously, because they're wearing clothing. But if we consider, however, that the teaching is being given by a Digambara monk to Digambara men, we have to realize that all the white bodies that we see in their white clothing surrounding the Digambaras are not Svetambaras, but they are Digambara females looking in and hoping that after this lifetime, they'll be born into that inner circle. And so we can see the very gendered dynamic of the Digambara sect especially, right? We can see how females retain a sort of marginalized position when it comes to achieving the highest spiritual goals in the Digambara tradition. And this picture really does a nice job of showing just how that actually works in practice, right? It's not the Svetambaras in that outer circle or that middle circle. It's the Digambara nuns waiting, not in this lifetime, but in a future lifetime for their turn. Now, although there are these two different sects, the Svetambara and the Digambara, it's not to say that they aren't interacting with each other. They're obviously interacting with each other, and in a lot of ways, getting along with each other. So in medieval texts, as Dundas points out, there's bitterness between these two sects, right? Because they're disagreeing on a lot of the teachings, a lot of the central teachings. Do we have to wear clothes or not, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of bitterness and fighting over shrines and places, right, between the Digambaras and the Svetambara, who owns holy sites, right? And one thing to consider is that the Digambaras who went south maintain that extreme asceticism. They are more rural than they are urban, right? They have less wealth than the Svetambaras in the north, and therefore less power, right? So as these sects began to interact in the contemporary period, in our period now, as the southern Digambara sect, which didn't have as much money and power, began to interact with that northern Svetambara sect, who had a lot of wealth and power, a lot of disputes started to arise over who owns particular Jain shrines, or who has the rights to dictate what happens at these shrines. Because in the south, Digambaras had shrines for a really long time, but as the Digambaras came south, or the Svetambaras started to come south, they started to have disputes over these shrines, and they had more power, right? And as Dundas points out, he's citing another article from even earlier. In 2002, there were 134 disputes over holy sites between Svetambaras and Digambaras in India, right? So there isn't perfect harmony between these two sects, but I also want to kind of end here by saying that they also share a lot, okay? They share pilgrimage with one another, right? And other ecumenical activities where they come together to celebrate together, right? Especially, we might even say, in the diaspora. So for those Jains who have moved from India out into other parts of, for example, Europe, Africa, and the United States, when they cross paths, they will have more of a tendency to work together and get along, right? So in the Jain Center in Southern California, it wouldn't be uncommon for Svetambaras and Digambaras to be getting along just fine. In Switzerland, where I also work with some of the Jains in the Jain community, it's not uncommon for a Digambara and a Svetambara to know each other and to be perfectly fine with each other, right? So there are ecumenical activities, and there are also pilgrimage sites, for example, that although they're fought over, you'll still see Svetambaras and Digambaras worshiping together, even if there is some tension. One of the most famous of these is Shravana-Balgola, and we're going to talk about this particular site in future lectures. But as we end here, I'm going to show you a video of what was originally a Digambara site in South India, in Karnataka, Shravana-Balgola. I'm going to show you how the Digambaras worship there, but also keep in mind that the Svetambaras are now a part of this culture in the sense that they came down and there were a lot of disputes over this particular site. And nevertheless, as you can see in this great ritual that's carried out every 12 years or so, there is a coming together and a great celebration of the Jain tradition and of the forward makers and those who have been liberated and those who the Jains look up to. So ultimately, they are committed to the same principles. They just disagree on how to approach them and how to practice them. So I'll show you this film now.
Passing along the trunk road leading from Bangalore to the western coast, one's eyes are immediately arrested on approaching Chennarayapatna by a beautiful hill, bearing on its summit what appears at first to be a column. As one draws closer, one can see a colossal statue partially hidden behind the hill. This striking and unusual monolith, visible from miles away, marks the site of one of the most interesting tourist and religious spots in South India. Shravana-Balgola in the state of Karnataka derives its name from the Kannada words pale or white and gola or pond, an allusion to this splendid large tank in the middle of the area. The tank is also called Bhudevi Mangala Darsa or simply Kalyani, the mirror of good fortune to the earth goddess. It is a large village situated in the Hassan district of Karnataka. At 3,347 feet above sea level stands this enormous statue of Gomateshwar, popularly known as Bahubali, or the one with strong arms. Bahubali was the second of the 100 sons of Tirthankar Rishabh, the founder of Jainism. A much revered figure amongst the Jains, Bahubali's story exemplifies the inner strength of the Indian. He could also have procured the title of Chakravartin, an emperor, but he chose to give up everything and became a Digambar Jain monk. Bahubali meditated motionless for an entire year in Kayotsarga position, or the standing meditation, because of which climbers grew around his legs, thus the vine motif on the legs of the statue. This place at the foot of the Vindhya hills became a consecrated place for meditation by rishis on their path to obtain moksha, or freedom from the cycle of rebirth. The inscriptions in Kannada at the foot of the statue provide us with information about the ascetics that spent their time meditating and practicing the Jain Dharma. Interestingly, the inscription tells the story of Bhadrabahu Swami, one of the rishis who descended in the form of Gandhara Gautam with 13 other names. These ascetics were forewarned of a dreadful famine which would last 12 years, upon which the whole Sangh, or Jain religious brotherhood, gave up the northern regions and under his leadership migrated to the south. The festival of Mahamastak Abhishek thus has a gap of 12 years between each celebration. The stage is set for the elaborate Mahamastak Abhishek or head anointment ceremony of the world's largest freestanding statue of Bahubali atop Vindhyagiri Hill. The first records of Mahamastak Abhishek date as far back as March 13, 981 AD, and the last Mahamastak Abhishek took place in February 2006, with the next one only due in the year 2018. Built by the Ganga dynasty, this 57-foot high statue, a daunting symbol of generosity and sacrifice, gets anointed once every 12 years. Here, priests with thousands of specially prepared vessels singing hymns in the praise of the gods pour consecrated water from a special scaffolding made to reach atop the mammoth statue. For 10 hours straight, Bahubali is bathed in milk, coconut water, sugarcane juice, turmeric, flower petals, sandalwood, and saffron paste. The stone sculpture carved out of a single piece of rock symbolizes renunciation, self-control, and subjugation of the ego as the first steps towards salvation. As the vibrant colors cascade down the statue, thousands of Jain devotees gathered here sing hymns in praise of the Bahubali. The nude form of Lord Bahubali is also referred to as Digambara, or the one who represents complete victory over earthly desires. The ritual of the sacred bath occupies an important place in all Indian religions, be it Hindu, Buddhist, or Jain. As the day turns to evening, buckets of rich vermilion, a symbol for virility in our culture, is poured on Bahubali. Offerings of petals, gold, and silver coins, as well as precious stones, are made to Gomateshwar by his many devotees. If you are one of those people who seek a divine relationship with God or nature, forgiveness, healing, guidance, and personal transformation, then a spiritual journey of the Mahamastak Abhishek will help you accomplish just that. If not, well, it is still a spectacle to enrich all of one's senses.
What an incredible event that takes place every 12 years. As the narrator here mentioned, I highly recommend that you go to Wild Films India if you want to see something like this again and other videos that show really a lot of great cultural achievements in India. One thing worth mentioning here as we bring this lecture to a close is that, again, despite the fact that there are tensions and controversies and disputes between the Svetambaras and the Digambaras, there is nevertheless a great sense of devotion toward the Ford makers and toward the Kevalins, those who have shown the way, people like Bahubali, who's being anointed here every 12 years, who have shown the way to liberation. So it's also important to point out that there are these role models within the Jain tradition, right? The Tirthankaras, Bahubali, all of these people who have achieved liberation and are given great respect for it. But there is no ultimate God in Jainism. And I know the narrator mentioned God, and this is an important point of clarification right now, early on in your Jain studies. In the Jain tradition, there is no ultimate or higher God. Instead, each and every one of us has an individual soul that is something like God. Sometimes it's referred to as Paramatman, the highest self. Something like God, but it's not God in the sense that we think of a creator God that can come and intervene in our worldly affairs. It's a soul that is within us that is omniscient and that needs to ultimately be released by burning all of our karma. And so rather than being looked at as gods, these Tirthankaras, these great Kevalins, these people who have achieved liberation in the Jain tradition, they are looked at as almost spiritual mentors, people that Jains can look up to, whose path and life teachings and life example they can follow to perfect nonviolence themselves, and ultimately, just as those Tirthankaras and those Kevalins have done, liberate themselves, liberate their own soul. Without the help of any external God that's going to come and save them, the Jains do it all individually and on their own. If not in this lifetime, then perhaps in the next. Thank you so much for joining me for this lecture, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.